Welcome back to SciBookChat. I've talked about Frankenstein before. In that video I talked about the way that books like Frankenstein, but also other books, have influenced how we think about scientists. In this episode I want to compare the descriptions of Frankenstein to descriptions of science in more modern literature. Frankenstein is mostly written in first person, so in the next fragment you actually hear Frankenstein talking. No one can conceive the anguish I suffered during the remainder of the night, which I spent cold and wet in the open air. But I did not feel the inconvenience of the weather. My imagination was busy in scenes of evil and despair. I considered the being whom I had cast among mankind and endowed with the will and power to effect purposes of horror, such as the deed which he had now done. First person is a good way to get close to a character, and in that scene Frankenstein was alone and scared and unable to talk to people. But here's a scene from a much more recent book in which a scientist is also alone and scared and unable to talk to people, but it's a very different scene. This is a fragment from Andy Weir's The Martian, and in this we're basically reading the diary of Mark Watney, who is an astronaut, a botanist and an engineer, and he's stuck on Mars by himself. During the boring ass days, I'm working my way through the $6 million man from Commander Lewis's inexhaustible collection of 70s tripe. I just watched an episode where Steve Austin fights a Russian Venus probe that landed on Earth by mistake. As an expert in interplanetary travel, I can tell you that there are no scientific inaccuracies in the story. It's quite common for probes to land on the wrong planet. And also the probe's large flat panel hull is ideal for the high pressure Venusian atmosphere. And as we all know, probes often refuse to obey directives, choosing instead to attack humans on sight. So far Pathfinder hasn't tried to kill me, but I'm keeping an eye on it. It's not just the language that's different in between these books, but it really is the description, where one is described as very dark and gloomy, despairing, and the other, even though this guy, the Martian, has much more reason to despair, all by himself on a different planet, he's very relatable, he's sarcastic and funny, and that comes through in his diary entries. I think that overall, modern descriptions of scientists in literature have changed, and that scientists have become much more relatable since Frankenstein. I think this changed around the 1990s. This would have been about 10 years after this big boom of popular science TV shows in the 1980s. In the 1980s, lots of people already had TVs, and suddenly there were all these programs on TV that showed scientists. So not long after that, people started including more scientists in TV shows and in movies, and also in literature. You were more likely to come across a personable scientist than someone who's just a character solely for their scientific expertise. And if you go further back, like even not even as far back as Frankenstein, but if you look at like the 1950s, not a lot of people had TVs, and there were no popular science shows before the 1960s. So if you were ever to see a scientist, it was either because you knew one or you were one yourself, or you read about one in the newspaper. People had just much less contact with scientists as part of society until after the 1980s, 1990s, when suddenly that became much more common. Now if you don't know a scientist yourself, you'll have seen one on TV, and they're becoming more and more realistic. If you want to read fictional books about scientists, so it's not science fiction, but literature that includes very realistic descriptions of scientists, I suggest that you visit lablit.com. I'll put a link in the description below, and that they have a list of mostly books, but also some films and TV shows that have realistic scientists in them. Okay, it says battery low, so I'm just gonna see how far I get.